welcome to Home Ed Looks Like This. If you're new to my channel, welcome. My name's Liz and I am a mum of 4 in the UK. I now only home educate 2 of my children because 2 of them have moved on to college and university. Today we're going to be talking about the history of education and how it was influenced by the Industrial Revolution. In England, home education is now the default, and you actually opt into our school system. But what is the history of education in the Western world? Schools can actually be traced back to AD 597, and this is when St. Augustine set up a Christian school in Canterbury. Its purpose was to teach Latin and Roman text to the noble classed youth. So who was St. Augustine? Well, St. Augustine had been sent to England to spread the Christian message amongst the Anglo-Saxons. And from the very start, we can see the schools have been used for indoctrination. It literally depends on the character of those in charge. Between the year 600 and the 1700s, religion controlled education, and it was a route only readily available to the upper classes. It was initially designed for boys between the ages of 11 and 14. Other children in the UK remained home educated and would usually start work at around the age of 14. Up until then, they would assist in their duties with their parents. Trades would be passed down through the generations and were therefore honoured amongst the working classes. These schools played a huge role in our conversion from being a pagan country to a Christian country. And you can find more resources on the Anglo-Saxon conversion from sites like Twinkle, TES, OutSchool, and I accumulated a lot of research from across these sites because I was putting together a unit study for my son Anthony. I then ended up sinking my own teeth into it and wanted to share it with everyone. In 1563, the National Apprenticeship Programme was introduced, and we find that apprenticeships actually have linked back to the medieval ages and have just evolved over time. My dog yanked the phone then. And during the medieval era, upper class families would send their children away to host families to learn a trade. And this was taught through direct experience. In 1563, England then passed an act in Parliament to regulate apprenticeships and any on-the-job training. They introduced rules which limited the amount of apprenticeships any one master of trade could actually have. And they stipulated a 7-year training window because on occasion these nobles who hosted these boys for their apprenticeships would take advantage, and apprenticeships could be open-ended. So for the first time ever, there were regulations in place to protect these children. The Industrial Revolution then led to further changes in the 1700s. Mass production now meant people were flocking to the cities for employment, and factory work was booming. Poverty, however, was at an all-time high and climbing, and we see the church step in and set up a lot of charity schools for children in poverty. And in many cities this was introduced as childcare. Upper and middle class girls were usually kept at home and continued to be home educated or educated by a governess. Schools were heavily pushed in coal mining areas because they wanted the women working in the places above ground while their men were busy below ground. We now reach the 1800s, and in 1805 Anna now introduced Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi. And I don't know if I've said his name right, I probably haven't. But he was a wonderful man with radical ideas on education. And the Pestalozzi Trust still provides support for home educators to this very day. And I actually found a few resources on Pestalozzi on the Twinkle website, so it could be worth checking that out for yourselves. And many consider Pestalozzi the father of education. In 1803, he opened a boarding school in Switzerland. It had a nature-based hands-on philosophy that actively engaged children in their surroundings. And over the following 2 decades, schools sprung up across Europe and the Americas, modelling his philosophy. And now we head back to Victorian Britain. And in the Victorian era, children were still regularly employed in workhouses and factories. In 1844, the UK Parliament passed a law that stated that any child working in a factory or a workhouse had to receive 6 half-days of education a week. And in this era, working class children still could not read or write. They were trained to work effectively, but they didn't want them too educated. Funding was provided by the government towards their education and paid to workhouse teachers. And it was during the Victorian era when Parliament began to debate introducing a national school system. This created strong opposition from those who didn't want the Church of England to be in control of the child's education. Yet by 1870, the local school boards were introduced. And these school boards were responsible for making sure there were enough school places for children between the ages of 5 and 12. The schools were to be non-religious, but had up to 80 children per class. Work was by repetition, and corporal punishment was used. By 1880, they made a further amendment, and this made it compulsory to attend education between the ages of 5 and 10. By the 1890s, school attendance was relatively high with the upper classes. But as many schools charged fees, this ruled the majority of the working class out, and many of these children continued to work. Rules were, however, put in place to ensure that they reached the required educational standard, and fines were issued to employers if they didn't meet the requirement. In 1891, fees were abolished, so education became free for the first time. And in 1899, the school leaving age was actually raised to 12, and school boards even sent door knockers to chase up why children weren't in school, with various counties having more success than others. And this brings us to the Balfour Education Act, and this was passed in 1902. The Balfour Act abolished local school boards and established the local education authorities. Church of England schools were also placed under control of the local county councils. But this is the time period when we see free school meals introduced. There was a big push to expand secondary school options. Secondary schools were still primarily attended by the upper classes, because the working class teenagers would have to seek out employment. Summerhill School was opened in 1921 by A.S. Neal, and his school was very out there for the times. He defined Summerhill as a democratic school. This meant every voice was heard, from pupils to teachers to staff. Attendance in class was optional, the curriculum was flexible, and as long as it didn't infringe on the rights or safety of others, the children pretty much had free rein to choose. It was very child-led. In 1926, Dartington Hall School also opened, and this was modelled on similar methods. We now get to the well-loved Charlotte Mason, and a lot of home educators still revere and follow her way today. And Charlotte Mason was a British school teacher. She published her book, Towards a Philosophy of Education, in 1923. And if you can get a copy, it is well worth the read. In the book, she outlined the principles of teaching that she had practiced throughout her career. And she advocated a well-rounded education that took the individual into consideration. She felt it was important the parents were involved in the child's education, and she encouraged learning through experience, over cramming as much information as possible. And you will have seen me mention Charlotte Mason's philosophy previously in my philosophy blog, so do head over and check that one out too. We now reach the point where education blends with the women's rights movement. After the Second World War, women were demanding more equality, more rights, and more recognition. During the war, they had practically carried the country by continuing to do all the jobs the men were no longer here to do. And there was a huge focus on education being a right for everyone, regardless of the sex. And in 1944, we see the Butler Education Act being passed. And this act raised the school age to 15. And much like today, secondary school children were fed into feeder schools. And these would be secondary modern schools, grammar schools, and technical schools. A legal act was then introduced which placed the responsibility onto the parents, and it became the parents' responsibility to ensure each child was educated to their individual aptitude and ability, either by regular attendance at school or otherwise. And you'll find that this legal responsibility is still in place today, and it's one of the rules we home educators not only quote often, but we also adhere to. We then get to Joy Baker, and if you don't know who Joy Baker is, I seriously suggest you go and check her out. She's quite monumental for home education. To be honest, it wouldn't look like it does now without Joy Baker. And now there's a lot of controversy also surrounding Joy Baker, but it wouldn't be fair to say that she didn't have a huge hand in how home education in the UK is today. And Joy Baker was a mother of 7, and alongside her family she lived in Norfolk. In 1952, she began a decade-long battle with her local authority. She wanted to be able to educate her children at home, and having read the Education Act inside and out and the amended Butler Act, she realised that the or otherwise option could also apply to her. She felt it should give all parents this right, whereas this provision had actually been included for the wealthier classes who would still prefer to use a governess. They never expected the working classes to want to use that amendment on the end of the Butler Act themselves. Parliament was surprised at the audacity, and the media storm began. Now, this is where the controversy arises. At one point, Joy's children were actually removed from her care, and now many speculate that this was out of spite, which we know happens, and others are concerned that she was actually not a suitable mother. It took over a decade of battles, many fines and threats of prison, but eventually, a decade later, Joy Baker won. She managed to convince the court that her interpretation of the or otherwise provision was correct. And on the 15th of November 1961, she won the legal right to educate her 7 children at home in the manner she considered appropriate. We now get to John Holt, so let me introduce him. He is often called the modern father of homeschooling in the USA. And he published a book titled Instead of Education, Ways to Help People Do Things Better. And this was published in 1976. He stated that rote learning, so that's learning by repetition, created an oppressive environment, and that the school's goals were to indoctrinate children into being obedient employees. He introduced the unschooling philosophy, and he did an awful lot of work to bring US homeschoolers together. He wanted to create a community, a network of support. In the 1970s in the UK, home education was still continuing to grow. It did start off slow at first, but many parents over here were also attracted to John Holt's unschooling method. And in 1977, John Holt released a newsletter called Growing Without Schooling. Now, if you speak to a lot of home educators, you will see many of us in the UK refer you to someone called Education Otherwise, and they actively support the home education community. In 1976, their founders, the lovely Jeff and Iris Harrison, began their own legal battle with the LA as they wanted to educate their dyslexic children at home. They launched the very supportive Education Otherwise, and membership of the group grew quite fast. In 1996, an Education Act was passed, which finally included provision for neurodiverse children. It was called the SEND Code of Practice. And now, if my brother's anything to go by, this also had its flaws. It placed responsibility on the local education authority to identify, assess and make provision for children who were neurodiverse or had disabilities. It also stated that all children have a right to be educated in line with their parents' wishes. Now, another conversation you may come across in the home education community is the Badman Review. This was the review conducted by Graham Badman into elective home education in England. And after the review, he proposed a registration system be introduced. He stated this was to protect the vulnerable, and he wanted to insist upon home visits and a set curriculum for all home educated children to follow. Luckily, his proposals didn't get enough cross-party support, and the review was dropped. And in 2015, we see the SEND Code of Practice get amended further. The home education community in the UK is said to have risen by 75% since COVID. However, it is hard to know for sure because there are no set numbers because many parents aren't known to the LA. Now, this has been great for the home ed community, but it has sparked further talks of registration and given LAs more rights. And this has been met with criticism from the home ed community, who continue to fight for their rights to home educate their children at home in accordance with the current law. You can also look up the Lord Soley Bill for more background information. We have this tendency to look back with rose-tinted glasses and say schools used to be better. However, when we do actively look back, we realise the schools have always had their flaws, and they are actually quite stagnant at the core, and they haven't truly moved forward with the times in order to prepare children for life as adults in the modern age. and in the future that is to come. They're still very focused on the end goal, which recently has tended to be more office-based work. However, when we look at our quick advancements in technology, we have to ask ourselves, are schools going to be able to meet that demand? But that's a whole other vlog, because we are coming up to the 4th Industrial Revolution. And you can read about the 4th Industrial Revolution on the government website. It outlines their aims and their objectives. And yet those aims and objectives don't seem to correlate with the structure of the educational system and the curriculum in the UK. Now, I will do another vlog on the skills and preparedness we should really see schools introducing for the future. Again, it's personal opinion, but the modern age is moving so fast that schools truly need to redefine education. We need to shift our focus from a streamlined employment goal to building transferable skills. A well-rounded education which follows interest and encourages adaptability. I'll do a separate blog on the 4th Industrial Revolution and what traits and skills it looks like our children may need for the years ahead. And we can discuss whether we feel schools will meet that need too. Let me know in the comments below anything I've missed out on our educational history, your thoughts on the history of education in the UK, as well as from a global perspective, because across the West they tend to slightly influence each other. Let me know if you have any questions, press like, follow or subscribe, and I will get back to you in the comments. Thanks for watching.